Hi there. In this lecture, we're going to look at the idea of mountains in landscape painting and how they become this very important sort of source of inspiration to painters, scholar officials, painters in the late Tang and Song Dynasties. The word for landscape painting is shan shui, literally mountain water, and it becomes the primal subject of this painting genre. To begin with, we've already talked about this idea of a sacred mountain. In Taoism, we see a kind of spiritual affinity for the idea of mountains being the abode of the gods, mountains as a place or refuge where people find a sense of spiritual home, a kind of source of divinity. And these incense burners were meant to sort of evoke this idea of this ideal mountain where the immortals lived. Another important spiritual idea was connected to Buddhism and the Silk Road. Literally, the thing that connected China to India was this route through the mountains. And along that route were many Buddhist pilgrimage sites, places that people who were on their way to India to study Buddhism might stop, or they may not even go the whole way. They might find going out to these spiritual centers out in the mountains would be a place, a sense of refuge away from the hubbub of the cities. One very important spiritual center along the Silk Road was Mogaogu Dunhuang. At this place, we see a grotto of caves, places where the Buddhist monks and these would come to meditate and seek enlightenment, and the sort of images, shrines, and the paintings that we find there speak to the spiritual aspirations of the Buddhists who had come on this journey. Here we see Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, in this shrine, flanked by two attendants, and then this amazing fresco, this painting on the stone, where we see all of these divine beings populating this sort of fantastic landscape of mountains and clouds. Now, the kind of Buddhism that was worshipped here was this idea of Mahayana Buddhism. And a particular variety of Mahayana Buddhism was called Pure Land Buddhism. Now, in Mahayana Buddhism, we had this idea of good works, and the Bodhisattva was a person who stayed back from their own immediate enlightenment, their nirvana, and instead was there to help guide others to their nirvana. And there were these special bodhisattvas who were sort of taking care of this special place, this pure land. And this one in particular, Amitabha, was the source of infinite light. And he was the ruler over this Shujarati, the Western paradise. And there the Bodhisattvas would welcome you into this pure land. The need or sense of salvation in this pure land came about because it was felt it was very difficult to find enlightenment in this world. We have appetites, we have desires, we have just all the basic things that happen to our lives that ground us in the physical here and now. And so it was believed that if you prayed to this Amitabha, he would welcome you into this pure land when you died. And so the goal of Buddhism shifts slightly. Instead of hoping for enlightenment, you are hoping to gain access to this pure land where it'll be much easier to find enlightenment. You'll be in a place where enlightenment is more accessible. Now you can see on these landscapes the image of this sort of mountains, the fantastical, tall, and these fantastic creatures and mythical beings flying in the sky. This sort of spectacular sense of dragons and other creatures that are part of this kind of mystical world in the Pure Land. Another very important story that was flourishing at this time was the story of the journey to the West, based on the pilgrimage of Xuanzang, who went all the way to India. We talked about him earlier. Xuanzang traveled throughout India during the Gupta Empire and brought back all of this knowledge. So in the story, The Journey to the West, is sort of the fable of this pilgrimage. The monk Tripitaka goes on this journey and through this magical land, and he battles with his companions all these demons that are plaguing them and preventing them from seeking enlightenment in the West. And so this is this idea of a journey and a pilgrimage, an important idea in Buddhism, and this kind of finding salvation in the mountains becomes a very important subsequent image in this story. There is a long tradition of what was known as the cult of the mountains, the mountain being a sacred place, not only these sort of mythical, idealized mountains, but actual very real mountains in China that were attributed to have certain spiritual powers in certain spiritual places, and people really went to these mountains in a kind of Taoist idea that going to the mountains would bring you closer to the immortals. Now, the Taoist idea of immortals is rather vague, and it wasn't as clearly defined as, say, Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism. So the more scholarly, the people who were more seriously attempting to sort of find their way to this through a process of meditation and pilgrimage, they would be more attracted to the traditions of Buddhism. Here we see a stele rubbing from a carved in stone panel, which reveals these shapes, these sort of characters that are the patterns and designs of the mountain, these 5 sacred mountains. And this particular mountain was found on a mountain. People would come to the mountain. They would make this pilgrimage. And then by making this rubbing off this stele, this stone relief on the mountain, they would find a way to kind of bring back some part of that spiritual power that was in the mountain. These symbols representing the kind of spiritual core idea of the mountain. When we get to the Tang Dynasty, there was especially the collapse of the Tang Dynasty and the sense of dissolution, mountains take on another kind of a sense of refuge, away from the chaos and destruction in the cities after the fall of the dynasty. The mountains are this kind of eternal refuge that's harkened back to a simpler, earlier time, closer to the gods, when people lived in harmony with nature. As Tu Fu said, the country is shattered, but the mountains and rivers remain. So this sense of the government may fall, the people may be scattered, but the mountains and the rivers, this is the true, real heartland of China. And if you look at here, this Huangshan, the Yellow Mountain in China, you see that the character of these mountains is extraordinarily craggy, high, inaccessible peaks. The sense that, immortals or mythical beings could live in them seems quite reasonable, considering how fantastically tall they are. Now let's look at some paintings. Beginning in the Song Dynasty, there became a kind of longing for landscape, and as a kind of response to the turmoil and the constant sort of barbarian invasions, the landscape becomes this very important spiritual refuge. At the same time, there's this new ideas about Confucianism that's more grounded in the real that comes about at this time. And these all kind of come together in this new Shanshui, mountain water landscape paintings. This painting by Fan Kuan is quite famous. It now exists in Taiwan. It's quite tall, 6 foot 6 inches, and some of these landscapes are now monumental. They're vertical instead of having a scroll with this very intimate sense of a journey. Now these large vertical compositions really dominate. They sort of take in the whole viewer in this rather spectacular way. This is painted on silk, and it is only done with black ink. So when you see what looks like mist rising up between the rocks, that's really no paint. That's just the absence of ink, even though it really feels like it is actually something physically present in the picture. Let's zoom in on this. You can get a better sense of the delicacy and the extraordinary nuance that goes into this incredible painting. And the realistic treatment of the rocks and the trees. And then there's this tiny stream that just breaks through this magnificent mountain. And that stream that's cutting through the rock, that's just the absence of paint. That's the absence of ink. And the thing about silk is that you put down a mark, you put down a line, and there's no eraser. There's no going back and taking it off. There's only that sort of the absence of having it painted. So the really an incredible tour de force of painting technique that goes into this amazing monument. This was enormously influential painting as people began to see and experience this idea of the mountain in this monumental way. Now I want to zoom in here on the lower right corner and show you the only people. The title of this painting is this idea of travelers amid rocks and streams. But to find the travelers, you really have to look close. And this sort of tiny little, they're just sort of dwarfed by this enormous mountain. And the idea is that human activity, human interests are insignificant to the power and overwhelming presence of the mountain itself. So this is really the heart of this story, is that we are supposed to look and experience the mountain in its sort of immediacy and its power and its grandeur. And all human concerns are insignificant. As I mentioned before, this is a time, the development of Confucianism, where Confucianism kind of separates itself from some of the sort of earlier mystical leanings and tries to reground itself in more pragmatic ideas of the here and the now and the real. This sort of critical thought. Now, this is not actually, we would call this scientific objective thought, but this kind of objectivity meant that the spiritual would be found in the real. Okay, so to look for these sort of underlying principles, the ideals of things in things. And this was a way to promote this idea of self-cultivation. A very important idea in Confucianism is that you are examining and exploring and learning as a way of refining and improving the self. As the sage views the world, there is no one thing that is not his own self, Zhang Zai. And that idea that as you're seeing the world, it's all an extension of you, and you can learn from the world as it will teach you about yourself. And they would have this idea that rocks are kernels of energy and trees are enduring life. And so the rocks and the trees are kind of moral principles and ideals that people need to learn from. And in this very idealized way, the mountain we're looking at is not any actual mountain. It doesn't actually exist anywhere in China. It's like those mountains. It's clearly looks like a mountain, but it represents something more powerful, more fundamental. If you look at the composition, you notice these two great cracks that divide the three parts, the large one in the center and the two smaller ones on either side. And then there's sort of this pathway, journey, stream that cuts along the bottom. You'll notice that the composition creates a shape and form that harmonizes with the very character in Chinese for the word mountain. And that the word mountain, this composition is telling you mountain. It's this way in which the mountain speaks of its identity in this kind of primal and immediate ways. This would have been unmistakably obvious to anyone in China viewing this picture, that it's saying to them, this is a mountain. Fan Kuan, when he's painting this, he's not just inventing this. There are a lot of other people working in landscape, and a lot of writing that's been done and thinking about landscape that has happened for a very long time. For almost 500 years now, he's ideas, the 6 laws of painting, have had a very powerful impact on how people talk about the paintings and how they frame and focus their ideas about what makes a good painting. So I want to talk some about these His 6 laws of painting and use Fan Kuan's painting as a kind of model for how we can see those. The very first principle, the most essential one, is this rather complicated word, qi yin shen dang, the spirit resonance. And it starts with this first character, qi, which just means the spirit energy or breath. And where do you find that in a painting? The sort of rhythm and breath of the spirit resonance of a painting. For some, it doesn't actually exist in any one place. It's just sort of the totality of the experience of being in the presence of the painting gives off a kind of wind. And some says it's really this sort of empty space, that mist rising, that mist that really is no mist, that isn't any kind of a picture that can be brought out of into being, brought into a kind of place that you can see. So this sense of rhythm and motion, these are very important qualities in the painting. The next is the idea of the bone structure, the bones, and this is the brush strokes, and it must display the painter's character and spirit through the strokes. Another important idea in He's 6 laws of painting is the concept of the relationship between the object and the form. This is generally aiming at a kind of coherence, a kind of unity between sort of the structure and the line and the form of the object being depicted by the painter. Another of the 6 laws of painting speaks directly of color. Now, you'll see there's actually very little color in these paintings, and over time, Chinese painting would become kind of less and less infused with color, and tonality is really the key idea that's being talked about here. And this, again, should be with the kind of correspondence to the real image. And so this is idea that it's not supposed to, exactly be a copy of some actual thing, but it really needs to have the kind of full range of tonality that you can find in nature. Then we have this idea of this management of the composition, that the totality of the picture needs to be taken in, and the way in which the structure of the picture can enhance the rhythm and the breath, those central ideas of qi energy. Lastly, there's an idea of transmission and accumulation through the copying. And this is a really interesting idea because, of course, in modern art today, we sort of privilege this idea of originality and something that no one else has done before. But really, Chinese painting is a very conservative tradition that is speaking to and kind of in a dialogue with painters and masters of the past. And this is a very important idea when we talk about painting. Very often there's a kind of sense of a dialogue with what's come before. And it's not that they're imitating exactly what's there, though there are people who are capable of that. The idea is to find a sense of how you work in relation to what's been done. And that there's always a sense that the past is some sort of paragon of artistic talent and ability, and that the present is just a dim shadow of what has come before. Another painter who is working about the same time as Fan Kuan is Li Cheng from The Temple Amid Clearing Peaks. And again, you can sort of see that three-part division of this towering monument of a mountain. And right in the center of this sort of lower raised portion is this temple, just sort of rising out of the mist. There's a sense that this is this sort of perfect feng shui. This is the perfect, we talked about the geomancy of Taoism, that you want to be there, this abode, this sanctuary, this place of refuge that you can journey to. That sense of coming into this landscape is kind of inviting. Now you'll notice that the trees in Li Cheng's paintings are especially twisted and gnarled, to sort of heighten this idea of battered and yet still thriving trees. This sense that is so twisted that they are often called the crab claw style for their extraordinary carbuncling appendages. Here is a painting by Juran, who was active about the same time. And here you see a more kind of looser treatment of the mountains, this kind of waves and rippling forms across the peak, creating this sort of rhythms of nature. And this is, again, the idea of the harmony and the flow of nature. There is, as before, a kind of pathway into a kind of sanctuary, a place of refuge that your eye goes into, the sense of you want to be here. This is a place where you find some kind of peace of mind. And this title of this work, Seeking the Tao in the Autumn Mountains, speaks directly to the sort of desire to kind of return to this place of spiritual resonance and spiritual power. Let's have our review quiz. Question 1. What is the significance of the location of the Dunhuang Caves? Question 2. What philosophical ideas defined Pure Land Buddhism? Question 3. How was the Chinese landscape represented in Shanshui painting? Question 4. What is the significance of the composition in Fan Kuan's painting, Travelers Amid Rocks and Streams? Question 5. What is spirit resonance, and how can it be identified in a painting?